Praise be Jesus Christ, and welcome to our fourth episode of CarmelCast. I'm Brother Pier Giorgio of Christ the King.
And I'm Brother John Mary of Jesus Crucified. CarmelCast is a production of the Institute of Carmelite Studies Publications. For more information, visit icspublications.org. So today we're going to talk about what I think is actually a very interesting and exciting topic. We're going to be talking about passive prayer. It's also a topic I think that's there's a lot of mystery around. It's something that's it's hard to put into words. It's hard to talk about. So yeah, we definitely need to, I think we need to proceed with some sort of some caution because It's something that can't really be put clearly into words. And we started talking about this topic a little bit last week about passive prayer and how God works in our prayer life, where at the beginning perhaps we're doing more of the work, more active prayer, and over time, we'll find that God is doing more of the work for us.
Right, and we use the analogy that St. Teresa of Avila uses with the four waters and how drawing water from a well is more active, but we can innovate on our ways of drawing water, and God brings those about through aspects of passive prayer and degrees of passive prayer, from using a water wheel or having a stream run through our garden, or even, for rain to fall on it directly from God. That's how Teresa sort of explains that, the degrees of moving from active to more passive prayer.
Right, and something that I think we'll experience perhaps in our prayer as this is happening is just that our prayer becomes more simplified. As it becomes more passive, it becomes more simple. So perhaps if we spend a lot of time meditating or reflecting over teachings of the church, or reading a lot of books, or doing a lot of vocal prayers, we'll find that those become more and more simplified as we step aside and allow God to do more of the work in us during the time of prayer.
Right. St. Teresa of Avila uses the example in the way of perfection of how at one point, someone may be having to pray Our Fathers over and over and over again. And she says that even though God heard us in the first Our Father, right, sometimes it takes that long for us to recognize God's presence in that time of prayer. And that as prayer becomes more simplified, even in active prayer, that those Our Fathers kind of turn into one Our Father that maybe lasts the whole length of our time in prayer.
Right, and I think we'll also find ourselves perhaps just making little acts of love throughout our time of prayer to help to focus us back on God, to really kind of stir our will to love God, but it will be less occupied with making constant, lots of movements in our prayer. So maybe one thing to talk about now is just, we're kind of talking about it, but what exactly is passive prayer? I mean, it's hard to explain. We said that it's when God begins taking over and doing more of the work in our times of prayer. But also, I think using John of the Cross's definition here is very helpful. He talks about this type of prayer as an influx of God into the soul. So whereas before we use these means of prayer as sort of, they become, they mediate our experience. They help us to reach God, whether that be through words or through thoughts, things like images. Whereas this type of prayer it's more of a direct contact with God Himself.
Right, yeah, and I think one of the reasons why this is so difficult to talk about, John's definition is great, the influx of God into the soul, but because it's so nuanced, like this is God's work, right? So just as God is working in us in this prayer. He's coming into our soul. So that looks different for everybody. And different souls who have experienced this prayer have experienced it in slightly different ways, or maybe with different emphases, or with more of their personality as opposed to a more sort of general or scientific or theological understanding. It can be different for everybody. And there's definitions galore too. One of my favorite definitions is from the 17th century Discalced Carmelite friars in Spain, in Salamanca, and their definition talks about how this sort of supernatural prayer is simply a gaze upon truth under the influence of love, I think is their definition.
Yeah, that's a very good point about how this is, it's the same God who's acting in all of us, but because we are also different, I think it's St. Thomas is the one who talks about that God works in the mode of the receiver.
Sure. Yeah.
So it's God acts in one way because he is one, but we all receive that based on who we are as people, based on our personality, our culture, our past experiences, our ideas of God. And so every single person, because we're all so different, is going to have a different experience of this. And so I find it's hard to talk about because often people will ask questions and they want to know, like, well, what is this going to be like? And you can't give an answer to that because the way that I experience it is going to be very different from the way that someone else will.
Yeah, the line that God imparts through the mode of the receiver, and also grace builds upon nature. If we want to continue with St. Thomas Aquinas, this idea that our nature is sort of the baseline, right? And God adds to that supernaturally. That's even the etymology of the words of our nature, and then God's super nature above our nature, and how that is added onto from the divine nature, the super nature.
Yeah, and we can see this diversity in the way that this is experienced, I think, very clearly just by looking at our own founders, looking at St. Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross, because they both write about this kind of passive prayer, yet they write about it in nuanced ways. Mm-hmm. Because of who they were as people and how they experienced it. So a lot of people read about reading Teresa of Avila, the Interior Castle especially, you'll read about these great ecstasies and things like that. But John says a lot less about those things, and his experience is more one of dryness, or maybe like an emptiness almost, which seems so different than Teresa's very just like passionate, like fullness that she experienced in this same type of prayer.
Yeah, Teresa likes to sort of dissect the different nuances of the different ways that God's acted in her soul, and the way that she's experienced that in guiding the people who came to her for spiritual guidance as well. Whereas John, I think, St. John of the Cross sees it more as sort of from an eagle eye sort of perspective, where he kind of sees that, well, these are all doing the same thing. This is God, the influx of God into the soul,
right?
And that's very simple. No matter what nuanced sort of experience that Teresa experiences throughout her life, John sees the work of grace.
Right. Yeah, and so we shouldn't necessarily just like read, about someone's experience of ecstasy and assume that that's going to be our same experience and be looking for that experience, because that's not, God knows how to lead us best. And so in this type of prayer, really, we just have to be open and receptive to what he wants to give us, because he's going to give us what's most necessary for our own growth. So now maybe we can transition to, I think questions arise when people begin to experience more passive prayer. Mm-hmm. As we mentioned, at times our active prayer, the amount of work that we are doing, will just naturally become more simple, perhaps, as we progress. And so then people begin to, at times, they're worried. They're saying, well, what's happening? Before I used to be able to pray, 3 rosaries during my holy hour, and now I can only pray one. Or, we have these people become worried that they're becoming lazy, or they're failing to pray. And John of the Cross, he obviously experienced people with these same fears, because this is what he writes about, is how do we know, what are the signs that God is calling us to this more passive kind of prayer?
Yeah, and I think, again, that can be different for everybody. And I think there's definitely clear distinctions between men and women, for instance, or maybe even different sort of temperaments that people have, that these sort of these changes in our prayer life it's sort of a different sort of feeling for everybody and different signs for different people. But St. John of the Cross does say that there are some sort of general signs, I guess, of God calling a soul to more passive prayer.
Right. Yeah. And so these are he gives these three signs in the Ascent of Mount Carmel, but also in his work, The Dark Night. And he uses slightly different wording between the two works, but he has the same basic idea of what these three signs are. So maybe we could just talk briefly about what these signs are. Mm-hmm. The first sign being that the soul no longer has the ability to meditate.
Yeah, and going back to our second episode where we talked about discursive meditation, I think this is what John has in mind. And this sign, this inability to meditate, I think it comes from it just seeming like you're in discursive meditation, like your brain is just glue or something like that. And that's, I think, a common experience that many people have.
Right. Yeah, I know for myself, when I was first experiencing kind of a reversion to the faith in college, I mentioned this earlier, how I was drawing so much over meditating over the teachings of the church. Mm-hmm. And I felt like in prayer, I was getting all these great insights. I was really enjoying that time of prayer, because I felt like I was really growing a lot in my faith. But then eventually I felt like those insights weren't there anymore. And, mm-hmm. and suddenly it was, it became harder to talk, to really sit there and think about these things.
Yeah, I think when certain truths of our faith become more habitual in us, and they maybe they don't arouse as much affection in us because we're so used to them. It becomes a little bit more ordinary in our life, where in prayer is aimed towards an extraordinary experience. It's aimed towards a supernatural experience. And I think that's a good sign that we're kind of drifting away from our natural modes of relating into more supernatural modes, extraordinary modes.
Right. Yeah, because then, when you can no longer meditate in this way, there's this fear of like, well, what am I doing wrong? Mm-hmm. Why has this changed? Am I just becoming lazy? And what's happening here? And so, that's why John offers this as one of the signs. Now, one thing that's important about these three signs is John says that all three need to be there. So just having this one sign isn't enough, because not having the ability to meditate doesn't necessarily mean that God's calling you to, at that time, to more passive prayer. It could mean you're not perhaps in a physical or just psychological place in order to meditate.
Yeah.
If you're busy or asleep. Right. Yeah. So this sign on its own isn't enough. Mm-hmm. But then taken with, maybe we can go to the second sign now, is that the soul no longer has a desire to meditate.
Yeah, and that's why I brought in Teresa's experience a little bit more, because, for her, it was just so, she was a very busy woman, and she was a very hardworking woman. And when she went to prayer, she was seeking sort of a restful time with her Lord, and that was very important to her prayer. So she really just didn't have time for sort of these really laborious forms of meditation.
Yeah, and I think it's even good. We're using the word meditate, but we can even relate this to, like, for example, we gave of praying the rosary earlier. Mm-hmm. Whereas you could find praying the rosary very fruitful for a time, but then you get to a point where you find yourself just becoming, almost unable to finish a rosary.
Mm-hmm.
And you also find that it just becomes, a burden to you to pray in that way.
Mm-hmm.
And those are both, I think, of these signs that we read about in John of the Cross as well, that perhaps God's calling you then to approach this in a different way.
Right.
So like I said before, these two signs aren't enough even, because not having the desire to meditate, John of the Cross even mentions that this could come from perhaps being in a state of mortal sin.
Right.
There are other things where perhaps we are despondent, we're becoming lazy. So this sign isn't enough on its
By
own.
itself, right.
And it's not enough. These two signs together even aren't enough on their own. The focus for him and for Teresa is really on this last sign that they talk about. And this third sign is that the soul just desires and takes pleasure in remaining in a loving attentiveness to God.
Yeah.
This is the sign. Really, Teresa doesn't talk about three signs. This is really all that the only one that she talks about is, this loving attentiveness, this finding a peace, and a sense of quiet in God's presence.
And I think that's why you see that really at the center focus of the method of prayer that she really recommended, the prayer of recollection, of active recollection, because it was aimed towards this end, right? Aimed towards that loving attentiveness to the one who is with us, right? And that's was her way of, the way that she wanted her nuns to kind of move in towards that direction.
Right. Yeah, and John and Teresa, I think they both talk about this as a sort of quiet or peace. But again, we don't want to get the wrong idea about those terms either, because in this, Teresa talks about, her imagination just running wild.
Mm-hmm.
And John talks so much about aridity and dryness.
Right.
So again, I want to stress the point that this is an experience that all of us will experience in different ways.
Yeah.
And it won't always be a sense of quiet and peace. On a deeper level it is, but not necessarily on the level of our experience.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's we have to always be reminding of ourselves that even when these aspects of our prayer become different or change a little bit, we should always be looking to the fruit that this time in prayer is bearing in our life, and how it bears in our relationships, in our ability to be charitable to the people who live with us and who we work with. And those are the good sort of signs of seeing that this is not something to be, prayer is not something to be sort of left behind, because it's changed from something that was at one time exciting and new to maybe, just changing. God starts to work a little bit differently.
Yeah. And so then we've experienced these three signs. Then we can go through them one more time. So the soul can no longer meditate. The soul no longer has a desire to meditate. And then the person just wants to rest in a loving attentiveness to God.
And I think it's important to clarify too that because when you say them so quickly, I think about, like, it could be confusing to someone to think that that this is a loss of desire to spend time in prayer, that to not confuse the word meditation with prayer, because that's not occurring in this sort of change, right?
Right. And this peaceful, this deeper peace, inner peace that we're talking about actually is a greater desire, I think, for prayer typically.
Right.
I can think of all these, hearing people's experiences of, they just have this great desire to be there with our Lord in the chapel, or to be in the silence of their room, but they don't feel like doing anything. They just want to be there with him. Or they find that the things that they were doing before, whether it be more devotional prayers or meditation, they find those more laborious and taxing, and really they just want to rest and be at peace. I think that these are all good signs that God is calling us to a deeper kind of prayer. So then what's our response then? What do we have to do if we are recognizing these own signs in ourselves? I guess, I think the main thing is just to be open to it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and be open to it and to be, and not to force it, right? Because like Teresa says, I think it's in the fourth mansion, the fourth dwelling place of the interior castle. I mentioned this earlier, that we should keep using the things that God's given us, the faculties of our soul, our intellect, our will, in the way that we're used to using them until God gives those faculties something better to do,
Right.
Which is that sort of change, and God will initiate that. That's why this is passive prayer.
I remember in the ascent of Mount Carmel, John, we actually just studied this in our formation classes, where John talks about these 3 signs in the ascent of Mount Carmel. But then one of the next chapters, he goes on again about how you must continue to use the intellect in prayer, even at the beginning of when you're experiencing these signs. So what he's saying is, yes, we should meditate less and be more receptive perhaps to what God might be offering us, but we don't just like shut all those things down. We don't stop praying our devotional prayers. We don't close our spiritual reading, all of that. What he's saying is that we'll become less dependent on those things and perhaps use them less.
Right. Yeah, because I think people can get confused, especially with sort of the plurality of different sort of spiritualities that are out there. Carmelite spirituality is not a spirituality where we're sort of emptying our mind or consciousness or something like that. That's not what Teresa is doing. That's not what John of the Cross is doing.
Right. Yeah. And so then our time of prayer, it's not like it's going to go, from one day being totally active to one day just being this sort of emptiness or something like that.
Yeah.
What's really happening is that we're going to find that we can just make little acts of love, or perhaps rather read something or look at an image, something that sparks our will towards God, towards Jesus Christ, and then remain in that attentiveness. And then when we find ourselves distracted, when we find ourselves just our mind wandering, then we can use these means again to make another act of love, to kind of pull ourselves back. So slowly, our prayer is becoming more simplified, but those tools are still there and are helpful for us.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that concerning this type of passive prayer and God's really invitation to it, I think that we can see 2 perhaps difficulties or dangers concerning that. One being trying to force this type of prayer before the time has come, before God is inviting us to it.
Mm-hmm.
And the other danger is perhaps rejecting this type of prayer when God is inviting us to it.
Yeah, I think it can be difficult, for people. They want to experience, they're reading Teresa of Avila for the first time, and they want to sort of jumpstart these graces, right? But it really is a God's gift. And she even says that many people stay in the fourth mansion, as she called it, the fourth dwelling place of the interior castle, and don't really experience in their lifetime these more mystical experiences. And that's really because God's giving us what we need in the active forms of prayer. Those are bearing fruit. Those are affecting our will to know and to love God more.
Right. Yeah. So if we use the example of the 4 waters that we talked about in the last episode, it wouldn't make sense if we had water in a well and we were able to draw up the water and water our plants. It wouldn't make sense for us to stop and just wait for rain if there wasn't any rain.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we need to keep doing the work of drawing up the bucket and watering the plants while God's providing that water for us.
Yeah, and I think in the midst of prayer, this experience of drawing the water from the well it's enjoyable. So we should be enjoying the fruits that God's giving us, because otherwise we're essentially rejecting the gifts, the graces that God's giving us, and saying that I want something more advanced or better or something like that.
Right. Yeah, and that's the mistake, to think that this is better, but it's obviously not better, again, to sit there and wait for rain, because then our plants are just going to die. The better thing is for us to continue to water in the way that God's providing us the water.
Yeah, and as Teresa says, that faking it is not prayer. Right? It ceases to be anything at all.
Right. Yeah, and so our job is always, if we are finding that the time of prayer is beneficial for us and loving, to be doing spiritual reading or to be meditating or to be praying vocal prayers and devotionals, we should keep at those things because we're drawing a lot of fruit from those.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not until we experience those signs that we talked about before, when we don't have a desire for these things and we can no longer do them, that is then the sign perhaps that it's time to open ourselves up, to lay them aside and open ourselves up to receive what God wants to give to us at that time.
Yeah, I think that's a good sort of segue into the second danger,
Right.
Of not wanting to move into the more passive forms of prayer. And it can be, because it's so different, it's so strange, it's something we're not used to. So it can be scary. And I think it's also, we can become attached to previous forms of prayer that were bearing fruit in certain ways in our prayer, but now aren't. And we can become confused or just sort of attached or angry with God because something that was bearing fruit before doesn't seem to be working.
Right. Yeah, we can see again. I think of people have shared about their experience of this, and often it's a sort of fear that they're becoming lazy or that they're doing something wrong in prayer, and so they just keep at the same thing because they think that that's what they're supposed to be doing in this time of prayer, when really God's inviting us to something new. But we have to be receptive to that and open ourselves up to that.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why, and John talks about this, St. John of the Cross talks about this a lot, in the sense that this change, this difference, it really has a lot to do with sort of the structure of our interior, the structure of our soul, and how we're so used to experiencing things sensibly, and using our senses, and we know what we know through our senses and from what's around us. Well, when God starts to communicate to us in a different way that we're not used to, because it's it's not a natural way, but a supernatural way, that can be strange, and our senses don't know what's happening, and our intellect is confused, and
Right.
So that can be very difficult for people.
Right, because suddenly, like John talks about, we're experiencing an aridity, an emptiness, a dryness in prayer, or like Teresa of Avila talks about, we're experiencing peace, yet our imagination might be wandering all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not. It's something that we have to grow into, I think, slowly,
Mm-hmm.
and something that I think we need guidance in. If we feel like God is inviting us to this more receptive prayer, but we're not certain, it's a good time to perhaps meet with a priest or a spiritual director and talk about these things, because it can be hard from our own experience to discern these things happening in us. Often we experience it as a sort of rejection by God, or we can experience it as a despondency on our own part, when really we're doing all the right things and God is actually leading us in that way. He's helping us to detach ourselves from the things that we have grown attached to, the comforts of prayer from before.
Mm-hmm.
So in concluding, I think it's important to just recall the fact that this type of passive prayer is something that isn't just for religious or priests, or I know we have in our mind like just for the saints. This is actually something that God calls all types of people to, and so we, as we're growing in our spiritual life, we have to remain open to this and realize that God might be leading us in this direction.
Yeah, and we always want to be open to the grace that God wants to give us, and not to impede that or to reject it. So that's always very important when we're talking about letting God do what God wants to do.
Yeah, and then before perhaps we close with another reading from Teresa of Avila, I just maybe introduce what we're going to talk about next week. We're going to talk some about difficulties in prayer, some of the things that we face, whether that be dryness or distractions. These are all things that that Teresa of Avila experienced, that John of the Cross experienced, that we experience. I mean, these are our normal experiences in prayer. And so hopefully next week we can unpack some about those sort of difficulties that we all experience during our times of prayer.
Before we close out with our reading and sort of wrap up the episode, I also want to encourage people to interact with some of the discussion questions that have been happening on our YouTube channel. I know some people are listening to this on podcasts, whether it be Spotify or Apple Podcasts. There's lots of good discussion going on in the comment sections on YouTube. So when you're done driving and you get home, definitely check that out. And there's some great opportunities. Our final episode for this season will be sort of a viewer's choice, I guess you could say. So we're looking for good topics that maybe people want to hear more about, whether it's something that we've touched on, but maybe we can go that viewers want us to, or listeners want us to go deeper into, or whether it be something completely different. We've had a lot of good sort of input so far, but that's definitely something that we want to invite everyone to participate in.
Yes.
So to close out this episode, we have a reading, as we always do, and this week we're taking from The Way of Perfection, chapter 19. And in this section of The Way of Perfection, Teresa is talking about how it's not just for special souls that God calls to contemplative prayer. And she uses this analogy similar to John's Gospel of the woman at the well and living water. And she uses the living water as sort of an example of a gift that God is desiring to give to universally, not just to special people or just to saints. Saint Teresa writes, "Behold, the Lord invites all. Since he is truth itself, there is no reason to doubt. If this invitation were not a general one, the Lord wouldn't have called us all. And even if he called all, he wouldn't have promised, 'I will give you to drink.' He could have said, 'Come all of you, for in the end you won't lose anything, and to those whom I choose I will give to drink.' But since he spoke without this condition to all, I hold as certain that all those who do not falter on the way will drink this living water. May the Lord, because of who he is, give us the grace to seek this living water as it should be sought, for he promises it." Hey everyone, Brother Pier Giorgio here. Thanks for checking out this episode of CarmelCast. If you want to hear more of us, don't forget to click subscribe. Also, be sure to click like if you enjoyed this episode, and maybe even leave us a comment. We post discussion questions down below to get the conversation going. Want more information on Carmelite spirituality and the Discalced Carmelite saints? Then you'll want to check out our website, www.icspublications.org. There's a link in the description of this episode. From here, you can see all our current promotions and access our complete catalog for the writings of St. John of the Cross, St. Teresa of Avila, St. Therese of Lisieux, St. Elizabeth of the Trinity, and St. Edith Stein. If you want to stay up to date on all our promotions and new titles, then be sure to add your email to our email list. There's no better way to stay up to date on the latest Carmelite publications. Thanks for joining us, and may God bless you.